Welcome everyone. My name is Cecile Badenhorst and I'm in the Faculty of Education here at Memorial. In this session today, I want to cover three things that hopefully will help you to write your thesis more fluently and more easily. And those three things are a technique to help you conceptualize your research, something about writing and why writing is so difficult, and then the third thing is why we procrastinate around writing. So these three things I've used before in various other workshops, and students have said these are the things that really help them in terms of getting writing fluency and getting writing to flow. So the first thing we need to know about a thesis is that research documents are essentially arguments. We tend to think that research documents are around facts, but they really are about arguments, and they're conceptualized around a problem. And the problem is defined by the audience, the discourse community. So what you do in a thesis is you make claims, and those claims become more truth-like based on your evidence. So if your evidence is convincing for your audience, then your research becomes more like truth. If your evidence isn't convincing, it becomes more like opinion. So the problem needs to match your discipline or discourse community or audience. Dissertations are essentially long and complex projects and often chaotic, and this is one of the reasons why it is so difficult to write them. One of the things I want to show you is a technique that will take you through that chaos. It'll help you to find your way through the chaos, and it's called the problem, purpose statement and questions, or PPS&Q for short. This particular technique, if you can have a look at this slide, comes from Sharon Merriam. And her book on qualitative research is a very useful book if you're looking for something to guide you. Although it was developed in qualitative research, it's useful for any kind of research. So there are a couple of things I want to point out about the problem purpose statements. First of all, it's a thinking tool. It can be used in your writing, but it's foremost a thinking tool. So it helps you to think about your research before you actually write it. The second thing is that it's always a work in progress. Once you start it, you will always be revising and refining until you submit your thesis, because things always change in the research process. The third thing is that it can only be 1 page long. If you conceptualize your research into something that's longer than a page, you need to rework it. Okay. All right, so the problem purpose statement. The problem purpose statement begins, of course, with a problem. So what you need is 1 to 2 sentences, 1 to 2 sentences that state the problem. Now, all research is conceptualized around a problem, and I want you to think why. Why is it that research is conceptualized around a problem? Why would you need to do research around a problem rather than just a topic? And the reason is, of course, that if you're not doing research around a problem, the first response you're going to get is, so what? Why do this research? So the more you can articulate the problem, the more you can articulate the need for this research. So the problem gives you the rationale. So if you find it difficult to unpack the problem, then start with a sentence like this. The problem here is. Now, one of the things that happens with research is that there's an assumption that you come to research knowing nothing. So you tabula rasa. So here you are, and you know nothing about your research project. And then you come to the research, and you work your way through it, and you get to know things until you reach the end, where at this point you know everything about the research. So this is the assumption, is that you know nothing, you learn about it as you go along, and then gradually you know everything. But this is what actually happens in research. There is you, and here is the research environment. So it is chaotic. You're in the middle of things. So it's very difficult to find a beginning and an end. So you have to extract a beginning and an end. Sometimes you already know the research area that you're working in really well. So you have to pretend or you have to work out a beginning and pretend that you actually don't know enough about it and then go and do the research. So what the problem purpose statement does is that it allows you to take this complexity and to extract one thread. So one golden thread. So within this chaos, you will have many problems, and they're all related to each other. And what the problem purpose technique does, what the problem purpose statement does, is it allows you to extract that one problem, which then gives you your research area. And then as you become more comfortable with what you're doing, you can then begin to build complexity in again. But without having that golden thread, it's very difficult to work out what you're doing. And often we get stuck in the writing because we're stuck in the middle of the complexity. Once you've worked out the golden thread, it's much easier to get moving with your writing then. Okay. So how to find your research problem. So instead of trying to reduce it to one problem at the beginning, what I would suggest is you get a piece of paper and you brainstorm and you think of every single problem you can think of to do with your research. And then you go through your mind map and your brainstorming and you work out, you make decisions. You say, is this the problem that I want to focus on? Or is that the problem I want to focus on? And basically what you're doing is you're trying to work out what's in the foreground of your research and then what needs to stay in the background. Because there are problems that are big, but they're not part of this research. And they'll fade into the background, and there will be other problems that are really the focus of this research, and that's what you want to figure out. So the most difficult part of any research project is working out what the key problem is that you want to research. The other thing that you need to remember is that the problem has to be stated as a problem and not as a topic. And I'll show you an example a little bit later on. So 1 to 2 sentences that state the problem. That's the first part of the problem purpose statement. The second part of the problem purpose statement is the knowledge gap. And this is something that's specific to academic contexts. And it's based on the premise that all research is based on previous research. And the knowledge gap is really what is the gap that you're going to fill with this particular research. So again here, you want 1 to 2 sentences. And this is where you're going to explain the academic gap, okay, where your research problem may be around something that's happening in the real world and in a context. The knowledge gap is the gap in the literature. Okay, so 1 to 2 sentences that states what the gap in the literature is and how this research is going to fill this. So this becomes the academic rationale for this research. Okay. The next thing that goes into the problem purpose statement is something about the context. So the context is the time, the place, the people. The context grounds the research in a particular situation. So without a context, the research is often quite abstract. So the context, a sentence or two which says this research is taking place, in this place with these people at this particular time. Another thing that goes into problem purpose statements is the conceptual framework. Okay, now the conceptual framework, depending on what kind of thesis you're doing, will be explicitly stated in your problem purpose statement or not. So in some disciplines, you don't need to include a conceptual framework. In the social sciences, in education, in the humanities, the conceptual framework will be a very important part of the problem purpose statement. And the conceptual framework is the broad theoretical framework. It's the big picture that shapes everything that you do in this thesis. So the conceptual framework is something that no matter what research project you do, you will have a conceptual framework, but sometimes you need to explicitly explain it and other times you don't. So 1 to 2 sentences again that state what that conceptual framework is. And in a doctoral dissertation, a conceptual framework is much more important than in a master's dissertation. So that's something you need to think about in relation to your discipline and in relation to the type of research you're doing. The next thing that goes into a problem purpose statement is that there should be some kind of evidence for what you've put here before, what you've listed here, and there should also be some kind of logic. So what that means is that you're making an argument in this problem purpose statement that this problem is important enough to do research and that this knowledge gap is something that should be addressed and that this framework is an important way of understanding the problem and the knowledge gap. So because you're making an argument, you need to provide evidence. And evidence comes from 2 sources in academic contexts. It comes from primary research and secondary research. And secondary research is published sources. And they carry weight because of the peer review system. So what you want to put in here are secondary sources, published sources. If you can find sources that identify the problem, that's ideal. But any sources that can support the arguments that you're making here would make your claim for this research much stronger. So you would need to include some kind of evidence for the need for this research, and then all of this has to have a particular logic. So depending on your research, the way you present this could be very different. So for example, if you're doing research where the context is really important, so perhaps there was some law that was passed in a particular year, and that's given rise to the problem, then you might begin with the context and then move into the problem and then into the knowledge gap. But perhaps in your research, the academic knowledge gap is what's driving this research, and then you would begin with that and then move into the problem. And in other research, it might be the problem that's actually very important, so then you would shift the order. If your research is very theoretical, then perhaps the conceptual framework is the thing you begin with. So the logic refers to the particular order that comes out of the research that you're doing. Okay. So once you've got, that makes up the problem statement, and it really is half a page. So you can see that you have to be quite succinct about it. The next step is the purpose statement. And this again is 1 to 2 sentences. You could even have 3. And the purpose statement closes this sentence. The purpose of this research is to. The purpose of this research is to. So if you have that sentence in your problem purpose statement, then what you're doing is you're stating the broad goal of this research. So the purpose statement states the broad goal of the research. And whatever word comes after this, the purpose of this research is to. That word implies your methodology. So if you say the purpose is to explore, you're implying a qualitative, open-ended methodology. If you say it's to evaluate, you're implying some kind of starting point, a mechanism for measuring, and an end point, and then some way of telling the difference between the two. So you need to think very carefully about what it is that you're trying to do. And that word must be quite specific. So you don't want to use something like understand, because then your research methodology is vague. And whatever you state here needs to close the knowledge gap up there. Okay. So if the purpose of this research, whatever you've stated as the knowledge gap there, the purpose of this research should close that knowledge gap. Okay. And then you can add a sentence or two after the purpose statement which expands on the methodology. So if you say the purpose of this research is to explore, you might add a case study of a school in this particular district will be used, as data. So you can add a couple of sentences after that to expand on the methodology. So the next part of the problem purpose statement is the questions. And the questions need to unpack the problem. So the questions are one of the most difficult things of conceptualizing a research project. And that's because they often don't unpack the problem, but they introduce new problems. So when you think about your questions, think quite carefully about whether or not they unpack the problem. So the questions give you an idea of the scope of the project. For example, if you have 15 questions, that's going to be a very long dissertation. A master's thesis will generally have 3 questions, and a PhD probably 5 questions at the most. So the questions give you an idea of the size of the project you're undertaking. So if we imagine your problem to be an apple pie, then all of the questions should make up slices of that apple pie. So they shouldn't introduce anything new. They should be part of that pie. But because we don't come to research as a clean slate, and because we're often immersed in the research area that we're working in, often what happens is you get a plum pie question in the middle of the apple pie. And the plum pie question is often a conclusion. It's something we've thought of or we know intuitively, and it falls in there because we're immersed in this chaotic environment. So one of the things to look for is whether or not you've got a plum pie question in your apple pie. And I'll show you an example to see how that works. But the questions are one of the areas where the research conceptualization can go quite badly wrong. So you need to think carefully about your research questions. Okay, so just to recap a few things here. So this is a thinking exercise. Once you start it, and I would suggest you start it at any point in your research, you don't have to do more research in order to do this. You just begin writing down what you know. And then once you've got it written down, you begin refining it. So it is always a work in progress. It's always a draft. It's never finished. So you might have a vague idea of your methodology, and then as you start developing this, you begin to refine it more and more. It shouldn't be longer than 1 page. If it's longer than 1 page, you have to rework it because you want to have it as crisp and as succinct as possible. You want to have the essence of your research project and not all the other information that would go into the thesis. That's not where it belongs here. The other point is that the problem purpose statement can be used in your thesis, and I would suggest it should be used in your thesis. But you don't have to. That depends on you, your supervisor, your discipline, and what is required of you. But in terms of the thinking of it, what this helps you to do is to think through the big picture issues in your thesis. And once you've got those big picture issues down, then you can begin working on different components of it. So for example, to show you how this works, the problem will come into your introductory chapter. The knowledge gap will become your literature review chapter. The context will go into the introduction as well. The conceptual framework will be part of your literature review. The purpose statement becomes your methodology. And the questions become the data chapters. So the chapters where you present the data. So they'll become the findings and the discussion. Okay. So where the problem purpose statement is really useful is that once you've put this together, it becomes part of your abstract. All you need to add onto the abstract is key findings, a sentence or two about key findings. So the more you articulate the problem as a problem, the stronger your rationale for the research. The more you identify a key knowledge gap, the stronger the academic rationale is for the research. So you can write a really strong abstract for a conference or a paper just using this problem purpose statement. It also becomes the map for your research. So once you've written it up, then keep it somewhere where you can see it. Keep all the versions of your problem purpose statements, because you might find as you're working through that one of the questions that you asked initially was a better question than you decided to use later on. So keep all the iterations of your problem purpose statements. You'll be able to track your progress as well as go back to things that were important before. Okay, so here's an example of the problem purpose statement. And I'm going to just take you through it so that you can see the different components. So this is an example I've made up. And I've made it up to show you how it works. Sharon Merriam has more examples, and I have examples in my books as well. So if you're looking for examples, there are plenty around. So I'm going to read it out to you. More mature students are returning to higher education institutions in Canada than ever before. Statistics from StatsCo show that before 2004, 15% of students were above the age of 20 when entering their first year of study. Since then, the figure has increased to 35%. Okay, so what you can see from that is the context. So the context is Canada. We're looking at students who are older than traditional students, and we've got some statistics there to build up to the problem. Okay. Mature students find it difficult to return to studying after a number of years away from educational environments. So that is the problem statement. You can see that it is stated as a problem because mature students find it difficult. That is a problem. If it had to remain at a topic, we would say mature students in higher educational contexts. Something about that. It becomes much broader when it's a topic. When it's a problem, it becomes much more specific. So it's specific in that these students find it difficult to study when they return to studying. Okay, although research is being conducted on access to higher education institutions for mature students, reference, 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 and on mature students' academic performance, reference, 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 little is known about the studying practices of these students when they return to learning. So that is the knowledge gap. The knowledge gap is usually flagged by words such as little is known, although much research has been conducted on, few studies have examined, for example. So those words flag the knowledge gap. So you can see there the order has been changed, the context, then the problem, and then the knowledge gap. Okay, so now we move on to the conceptual framework. Febris and Segal argue that mature students often do not have the social capital necessary for successful completion of studies, which is why they enter educational institutions as mature students. So you can see from this problem-purpose statement that the theoretical framework is not explained in the problem-purpose statement. It's just hinted at that this will be the framework that this study will use. So this study intends to explore if the difficulties mature students experience in learning can be explained by a lack of social capital. Then on to the purpose statement. The purpose of this research is to explore what difficulties mature students experience when returning to educational studies after a gap period. So that was the knowledge gap, and this closes the knowledge gap. The study intends to research how mature students in the education faculty at Memorial University study and how these study habits relate to social capital. Okay, so now we'll move on to the research questions. So the research questions need to unpack the problem. So the study seeks to address the following questions. What does returning student mean? What difficulties do mature returning students experience in their learning? How do institutional inefficiencies impact on mature students' experiences of learning? What study habits do mature returning students have? And how do these study habits and difficulties relate to social capital? So if you can just look at the questions for a minute, you can see that there's a pattern to them. So they are unpacking the problem. What does returning student mean? So that could be a question that would be answered in your literature review. So it's a more conceptual question. And then the next question is specifically around the problem. What difficulties do these students experience? Question number 4, what study habits do these students experience? And then how do these study habits and difficulties relate to social capital? Those questions all unpack the problem. Question number 3 is a plum pie question. How do institutional inefficiencies impact on mature students' experiences of learning? It's an extremely important question and very valid, but it doesn't belong with this problem. So if you find that that's the question that interests you, then you rework the problem-purpose statements around that problem. And you do away with difficulties and study habits, and you focus on the institutional inefficiencies. So this question will fall into that group of questions because the researcher knows that often that is the problem, is that there are institutional inefficiencies. So when you're developing your questions, look at them very carefully to see that they are unpacking that problem, that you have a certain logic to them, and that you don't have a plum pie question in there. Once you've got a problem-purpose statement, it becomes a really important mechanism to get feedback on your research. So anytime you're stuck with your thesis, then go back to the problem-purpose statement, rewrite it, and then get some feedback on it. So even if you're at the end stages of your thesis and you're feeling stuck, go back to the problem-purpose statement, rewrite it without looking at your previous ones, and then you can compare them. But it'll help you just to think through the connections and the relationships in your thesis. Then once you get feedback, ask for specific feedback. So if you ask a colleague for feedback or your supervisor, you don't want to just give them your problem-purpose statement and say, give me feedback. What you want to do is say, tell me what my research problem is. So get them to actually verbalize it back to you so that you can hear that they have understood the problem that you've articulated. Is my knowledge gap clear? Can they state that knowledge gap back to you? And then you go through the various other components of the problem-purpose statement. But the point I'm trying to make is that you don't ask somebody, is it okay? You're saying, tell me what I've said to you, so that they can tell you back and you can actually hear whether or not it's coming across clearly. So this is something you can do with classmates or other people who are writing their dissertations before you give it to your supervisor, if that's something that you want to do. or you can do this with your supervisor. But it becomes a very useful mechanism for getting feedback on specific things. So for example, if you're stuck on the problem, then you just work on that. You get feedback on the problem. Okay, that's the problem purpose statement. And this is the one technique that's in all the workshops that I've done, which are quite a few, that all the participants in the workshops have said is the one technique that has really helped them to get going with writing. So yeah, I would urge you to really try it out, to write down your thoughts, to start today. In fact, as soon as we've finished with this presentation, go and do your problem purpose statements. So what I want to move on to now is just to think about writing for a little bit. So what the problem purpose statement does is it allows you to think through your research so that you've got a clear focus and a clear message. And it's much easier to write once you've got that done. But there are a couple of things about writing particularly that, if you understand, will help you to develop writing fluency. So there are three things that I want to cover here very quickly. One is the states of writing, the second is the stages of writing, and then techniques for writing fluency. So just to talk quickly about the states of writing. So we tend to write from two different states. One we'll call the editor's state. We used to call that left brain, but these days we call it the editor. And the other is a creative state. And both of these states are very useful. So the editor is very useful because that's the side of you that focuses on things like rules of grammar, punctuation, spelling, whether or not this is right. Whereas the creative writer in you is the part of you that is able to latch onto associations that result in innovations in your writing. The problem is that the editor often takes control. And the reason why the editor often takes control is because, and there's research to show this, that up until grade 4, kids love writing. They find writing to be something that's fun and enjoyable. From grade 4 onwards, so by the time you get to a PhD, the graph goes like this, where the higher you have, higher qualifications you have, or the more education you have, the less you tend to enjoy writing. And there's a reason for that, and that's because from grade 4 onwards, most students begin to see writing in terms of errors, making mistakes. So from grade 4 onwards, teachers tend to focus on sentence structure, whether your paragraphs make sense, and they move away from the creativity of writing into more the, what the editor needs to do in order to make this writing correct. So we go through school and we shift more and more into this editor's phase. Now that editor is very useful, but what happens is that if you're thinking of writing in terms of error, then you never allow yourself to take risks because you're focused on making it correct and being in that editor's state. So what happens is that editor becomes overly critical. So you write one thing and the editor's saying, no, don't write that. And that editor is very useful because what it's trying to do is to protect you and to say, well, if you write that, you will be ridiculed. Or if you write that, everyone will discover that you shouldn't be in the PhD program. And that editor, has its job to play. But if you want writing fluency, you have to keep that editor quiet, particularly when you're at the beginning stages of writing. So when you're at the beginning stages of writing, you want to cultivate the kind of creative writer in you. And then later on, when you get to revising, then you can go back to the editor and allow the editor in. So I just want to show you what I mean in this slide here. is that creativity happens when three conditions are present. When there's an environment of no criticism, including self-criticism, while ideas are being developed, where ideas are allowed to flow freely in a non-linear stream of consciousness, unordered manner, and where there are lots of ideas to choose from. So what happens with the internal editor is that it creates an environment of criticism, first of all. It doesn't allow ideas to flow freely, and it censors ideas as you create them, so you don't get lots of ideas. So it's very important to think about these two states of writing. When you get stuck, the chances are that you're in editor's mode. And what the editor is trying to do is to create a perfect document. Whereas what the creative writer in you needs to do is to create, to be allowed to write freely, that the editor can then fix up later. So the key point about this is that when you are stuck, you have to keep that critical voice quiet and you have to allow yourself just to write. And I'll show you in the next section how to do that, right? But the important thing is that you understand that writing comes from these two different states. And for academics as writers, this becomes a hyper state where you tend to be hypercritical of everything that you do. And the more critical you are, the less writing gets done. So if you're stuck, it's probably because you're in this editor's phase or state. And you need to be able to shift it into this creative state. So I want to move on to talking about why writing is so difficult. We tend to think that writing should be easy, but I just want to go through what happens when you sit down to write something. You sit down to write your introductory paragraph. So this is what you have to do in that minute that you sit down to write. You have to choose words, you have to think of syntax, grammar, punctuation, spelling, the purpose of the writing, the vocabulary, the audience, the style, the voice, the tone, the sequence, the structure, what you're going to put in, what you're going to leave out, the content, the ideas, the relevance, the logic, and I haven't even covered half of the mechanics of writing here. And if we look at the next slide, this is what's happening to your emotions while you're writing, is you're criticizing yourself, you're imagining criticism from others, you're feeling anxious, your self-esteem drops, you feel like you're incompetent, that this is going to show everyone what a failure you are, you worry about making the errors. Once the writing is written, it's there, no one can take it away, so you feel exposed, you feel like your writing is tied to your intellect and you're going to be shown up, that you don't have the talent for it. So there's a whole emotional level to writing as well. And then the third layer that goes on top of this is what's happening when we write in a discourse. So when you're writing in an academic context, all these other things are happening as well. You're having to think about writing in your particular discipline. So what are the conventions of that discipline? What do I need to provide in terms of evidence? What counts as knowledge in this particular discipline? If you're new in the discipline, then that shapes your confidence and your authority. So the context and the social conditions shape that. Whatever power issues exist in that context. So for example, if you're a woman in a male-dominated field, then your sense of authority as a writer is going to drop. So you know, one of the things we do as academics is we're developing our identity as scholars when we write. So your identity is shaped through writing. You are positioned by the text and you're positioned in the text. You can position yourself in the text. So all these things are going on when you sit down to write that introductory paragraph. And then you wonder why you want to get up and either go and eat something or clean something or go and check Facebook. It's because writing is extremely difficult. We have all these things going on. And coupled with that is this long-term process of schooling, which has taught us to be super critical of everything that we do. So that editor is made up of all the teachers who've commented on your writing at some point, your parents, other relatives, anybody who said anything about you or your writing. And it's even made up of imagined comments and people you think might criticize your writing. So it's not a rational voice by any means. It's not a truthful voice. It's a voice that's being created to provide us with protection, but it takes over. So what we're going to talk about now is how do we cope with this strong editor, and how do we allow this creative voice in, while at the same time deal with all the difficulties that we experience with writing. And this really is looking at writing as a process. So now we're looking at the stages of writing. So if you have a look at the slide, one of the ways you break down the difficulties of writing is to break it into these different stages. So the first stage is the pre-writing phase. So in this phase, you don't have to worry about grammar or language. You don't have to worry about it being right. You're just making notes and you're playing with ideas and you're focusing on the message. So in the pre-writing phase, and the problem purpose statement is part of the pre-writing phase as well. You're focusing on the message. So what you want to say. And you're collecting bits and pieces. You're collecting bits and pieces of thoughts, ideas, notes from readings, bits of information that you might need, bits of content. So the pre-writing is made up of many bits and pieces of writing. Then you go into a writing phase. And the writing phase is where you write a draft. Not the finished product, but a draft. And writing drafts is very important for overcoming the editor and for overcoming the difficulties of writing. I'll come back to the draft. And then in the final phase, which, they're not just phases like this. You'll come back to each of these throughout the writing process. But the last phase is revision. And that's where you move things around. You shift, you cut, you add, and then finally you begin to edit and proofread. So it's where you revise, edit, and then proof. Okay, so the revision phase isn't editing, it's moving things around first before editing and proofreading. Okay, so the importance of drafts. What you're doing in the pre-writing phase is that you are doing lots of writing, but you're not focusing on the language and the things that would upset the editor. When you get to writing the draft, the key thing about the draft is to get the whole story down in one sitting. So you've done all your thinking in the pre-writing phase. So when it comes to writing the draft, you set aside time, however much time you have, and you just say to yourself, I need to get this draft down, the whole story down in this one sitting. So if I set aside 2 hours to write one chapter, then I might have a chapter that's full of gaps, but I've got the whole structure, I've got the main story, and I have the end point to it. And I might have sections which say, fill in more here, read up more about this, add in more here, but the main story is there. So the message is there. And the first draft is always written badly. It's messy, it has all sorts of errors, and it's atrocious. And that's not a draft you show anyone. That is for your eyes only. But you allow yourself the freedom to move into the creative state and not the editor state. And you allow yourself to write messily, but to focus on the message. Once you've got the first draft down, and that is the most difficult thing, is getting that first draft down, because that's where you're pulling everything together. Once you've got the first draft down, then you go into the next phase, which is, let me sort this out. So once I've got it down, now I can fix it up. So then you take that draft and you begin working section by section, fixing it up, until you get to a point where you can begin editing. At this point, you focus on language. And once you've got it to your satisfaction, then you can focus on the nitty-gritty, spelling, punctuation, whatever. So you can see what we've done here is that instead of trying to do everything at once, we've broken it up into manageable bite-sized pieces. So you can use the writing process for a section, for a chapter, for a paragraph even, but it makes it much more doable. And you'll find that you'll be able to sit down and work on this rather than trying to do some overwhelming thing at once. The writing process, although I've put it down here on the board as these three discrete stages that you go through, it's not like that. You go through pre-writing and then you write a draft, you go back into pre-writing, you come back into writing again, you may do some revision. So it's not a clear-cut process. You're moving through these stages all the time. And the writing process is always a process of discovery, enjoyment initially, and then perhaps beginning to find difficulties and becoming discouraged, and then you get some enlightenment along the way, and then you can't believe that you were so stuck. So if you understand that that's the process you're going to go through, it becomes easier to manage that process. Everyone goes through that. Writing is never easy for anyone. Okay, so just to emphasize in this slide here, the importance of drafts. So because writing is thinking, you want to separate the thinking from the writing. So you do the thinking in the pre-writing phase, then you get it down on paper, focusing on the message, and then you fix it up. If you can do this one thing, write and draft, you'll find your fluency will improve enormously. So the first draft is always rough, it's always awful, and you don't show anyone. It's made up of all your bits and pieces of your pre-writing, and it's something that you work through. This is not the draft that you give to your supervisor. Once you've revised it and even edited it, then you give it to your supervisor. Okay, so now we're going to look at the techniques to help you achieve writing fluency. One of the techniques that overcomes the editor and that allows you into this creative space. So one of the techniques that moves you from here to here is free writing. In free writing, you allow yourself not to censor what you're writing. One of the ways to do this fairly easily is to set a timer. So you set a timer for 5 minutes at the beginning, and then you just write during those 5 minutes. You don't worry about what you've written. You don't worry about what it looks like. You don't go back and correct anything. You just keep moving forward, focusing on your thoughts rather than on the writing. So it's stream of consciousness writing. Once you've finished it, then you can go back and you can look at it and say, all right, I want to keep this, but I'm going to throw that away. And free writing can be done in a number of different ways. So for example, if you're reading for a literature review, you can make notes, but then you could also do a free write of that particular article afterwards. So what the free write does is it gives you your thoughts about what you're reading, rather than just taking the notes. So you can use your notes, but the free write will give you what you think about it, and you'll be able to use that as well. If you're stuck on a section, instead of laboring over it, you could just say, I'm going to free write this. I'll free write the introduction. In the beginning, 5 minutes seems like a long time, but the more practice you get, the easier it becomes. Free writing is a very useful technique, but it does take practice to let go of that editor. Okay, the next technique is mind mapping or organic maps. So they're sometimes called spider diagrams. These are the same kind of thing as free writing, except in a very visual way. So you're writing down as many ideas as you can think of. So you're brainstorming on paper. And what this gives you is the freedom to generate lots of ideas. So again, at any point when you're stuck, you put a topic in the center of your mind map and you think about as many things as you can think of. So if you're brainstorming your problem, you don't try and focus on one problem initially. You write down as many as you can think of, and then you go through and you begin to select. So what you're doing is, instead of trying to do everything at once, you're breaking it up into stages. So mind mapping is a very useful technique, especially with the complexity of a research project, because you can focus on small things at once, at one time. And then the last technique is sketching. Now this is a technique that often people are very nervous to use, but what sketching gives you that writing can't give you is that overall picture of the relationships. So writing is very linear, and you have to move through things in a linear fashion, whereas sketching can give you the entire diagram or image at once. So you're able to see the relationships between things in a sketch. You don't have to be an artist to sketch, but what you want to be doing is something like draw your research on one page and then just see what comes up. You might also, for example, draw your research as a tree. So then what makes up the roots of that tree? What is the trunk in terms of your research? What are the leaves, the branches, the fruit? So if you can then label that in terms of your research, it might give you some insight, not only into the coherence of the whole project, but into the sequencing of it, and maybe just some understanding of how things fit together. So sketching can be extremely useful and a quick way of accessing very complex things. And it's something you can do at any point. You don't have to be reading in order to sketch your thoughts. So if you keep a notebook, you can jot down things that you're thinking about, in the few minutes you have here or there. What I want to move on to now is why we procrastinate. So what we've covered so far is the states of writing, so between the editor and the creative writer, and the stages of writing where we break up the process so that it's not so difficult. So we do things in bite sizes that become manageable. So what I want to show you now with procrastination is why we actually get up. When you schedule time to work and you arrive at your desk and you sit down and you really want to work, but at some point you get up and you go and do something else. Why does that happen? And I want to just show you this, because if you can understand this, then you'll be able to work through those difficulties and persist. So what happens is that in academic writing, we're working with a lot of cognitively difficult things. So, if you think about writing a literature review, that's an extremely difficult thing to do. You're pulling together complex things, you're reading difficult articles, you're trying to figure out, who's saying what, how they all link together. It's a thinking process that is very difficult. And what happens when we run into blocks in our thinking process is that it impacts on our emotions. So if we're feeling that this is difficult, our emotions drop. If we feel that this is great and we're enjoying what we're doing, our emotions rise and we feel good. So the thinking plus the emotion then leads to action. So if the task is difficult, we feel bad, we get up and we go and do something else. And the reason why you go and check Facebook, or you go and clean, or you go and eat, is because those things will give you immediate satisfaction. So if you go and clean, which is something that I often do when I'm procrastinating, then what's happening is that you are able to control that piece of floor that you're cleaning, or that cupboard that you're cleaning. You're able to control it, and you're able to see immediate results. So the fact that you can clean that cupboard means that you are in control of that process. Whereas when you're writing your thesis and it's overwhelming, you are not in control. And there's delayed gratification, because you're not going to see the fruits of your work until months, maybe even years later. So when we move to do something else, we're generally doing something else that makes us feel better and makes us feel more in control. So going to eat something makes us feel good. So most books on writing begin with the action. They'll say to you, find a desk that's comfortable and make sure you write every day for a certain amount of time. For me, I think it's important to change things around and to actually begin with either what you're thinking or what you're feeling. So I'll show you how this works. So you're writing your literature review. It's complex and it's very difficult. You begin to feel anxious and overwhelmed, so you go and look for something else to do. So how can we overcome this, right? What can we do to change that pattern? Well, the very first thing is to break it into manageable pieces. And the smaller the piece, the more manageable it will be. The more likely it is that you'll stay and work at it. If you finish that manageable piece, you then feel more capable, which then allows you to persist with the writing because you feel like you're getting something done. There's an author, Joan Bolker, who's written a book called Writing Your Dissertation in 15 Minutes a Day. And she says that's all you need to do is work for 15 minutes a day. And she says students have said to her, well, how am I going to get my thesis written in 15 minutes a day? It'll take me 20 years to finish it. But what she's really saying is that if you're able to sit down and work for those 15 minutes, the chances are that you'll work for longer. So you need to break your task down into something that can be done in 15 minutes. So something that at the end of it, you'll feel like you've accomplished whatever you've set out to do. And if you do that, then you'll feel better and better about your writing. You're more likely to turn up to your desk. And then secondly, you're more likely to persist through difficulties. So the most important thing is turning up when you've scheduled to do that writing, even if you just sit at that desk for the 15 minutes and you don't move. The second thing is breaking up your task into something that you feel is doable. And because writing's a process, in the beginning, you might have to break it up into a very small task, but as you get into it, you'll be handling bigger and bigger tasks as you go through it. The minute you feel your emotions dropping and you want to get up and go and do something else, that's when you say to yourself, what's happening here? Why am I finding this difficult? What can I do to make this manageable for myself? Okay? So if at any point you decide to get up, you need to think what's happening. So that's how this works, is understand that your thinking can impact on your feeling and that your feeling makes you go and do something that'll make you feel better. So if you can understand that, then at any point when you get stuck, you can work through what the problem is. Okay, that's it for me. We've covered 3 things today: the problem purpose statements, thinking about writing and why writing is so difficult, and then procrastination and how you can think about it differently. We tend to think procrastination is about self-discipline, but actually it's not, as I've shown you. So if you use these 3 techniques, at any point when you get stuck, you should be able to draw on something that I've gone through today to get you going. And I wish you all the best with your writing.